Faced with growing calls to reform policing in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is putting his support behind police body cameras. He said that he would be speaking to the provinces about the issue very specifically later this week. Have a listen to what he had to say.
In regards to body cameras, it didn't come up in our conversation last Thursday, but certainly moving forward this week, it will come up. As you know, the federal government has jurisdiction over the RCMP, but there are many other provincial and municipal police forces that should be looking at greater transparency measures as well. And I will certainly be talking about with the provinces and premiers about the need to move forward on measures like body cameras.
Calgary is home to the only large police force in Canada with body cameras on all its frontline officers. About 1,100 of them have been wearing the body cameras since last summer. So how has it worked in that city? Naheed Nenshi is the mayor of Calgary. He joins us from there. Hi, Mayor Nenshi. Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Vashi, and thanks for having me on about this. You know, this issue that is certainly about body cameras. It is certainly about the future of policing and what that means. But I also think it's about a big, broader issue. I feel like something has shifted. You know, like a crack up in the Rocky Mountains when the ice cracks in the spring and the water begins to flow. And we're really having a long delayed, incredibly important conversation right now, which is about security, which is about policing. But really, it's about the right of every human being on this land to live up to their full potential, to live a life of dignity. It's about going from being not racist to being actively anti-racist. And man, we're privileged and honored to be in the middle of it, but there is a lot to think through.
Let me follow up on that, Mayor. Why do you have that feeling now, like we're at this moment, that it might actually, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but might actually lead to something that changes?
You know, I have taken a grand total of 1 history course in university, and my professor would be super mad at me for doing the number one thing he told us never to do, which is talk about history while you're living it. But something feels different this time. Something feels more innate. And yes, it's about the murder of George Floyd, it's about Breonna, it's about Regis, but it's about more than that. It's about having a very serious conversation. And when I hear, you know, politicians across the spectrum agree that there is a systemic issue of racism, that there is systemic racism. You know, I spent most of my weekend talking to people in Calgary who are in a position of authority or power or privilege, if you like, who are all saying, you know what, I need to listen more. Can you help me understand more what is going on? You know, I was in the midst of a very simple, very tiny thing myself this week where a very prominent person said something about me that came off as very racist, and there was a huge backlash. But that same person has been saying horrible things about lots of people for years and still, you know, is on national news shows all the time. So something I think, and the question is, how do we manage that change to a positive outcome for us all?
I know that you're saying that most politicians are acknowledging that systemic racism is real. There are some who still say, who disagree, I guess, with the assessment that it is as prevalent as it is. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Premier of Quebec, who said systemic racism doesn't exist, but he also interpreted that to mean, you know, not all Quebecers are racist. He also insists he's going to do a lot to fight racism. I'm just wondering, from your perspective,
you're just setting that up for me, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm wondering.
With that particular province.
Well, no, he's not.
It's the definition of systemic racism, not the provincial government passing a law that it admits is racist and requires the notwithstanding clause to back it up. I mean, that's the best example of all. In his own province, he himself passed a law that treats people differently if they happen to be a Muslim woman, a Jewish man who wears a yarmulke, or a Sikh man who wears a kippah. You know, yeah, okay, maybe some of the people in those situations are white people, but really they're not. Certainly, I think that's a great example. And what I go through every day, and the relentless racism that I face every day, is a tiny fraction of what Black Canadians face, what Indigenous Canadians face, what racialized women face. But he's right about one thing. The vast majority of Canadians are not racist. The vast majority of Canadians How do we go from non-racist to actively anti-racist? 6 months ago, that would have been an unbelievable radical thing. And I probably wouldn't have said that as the mayor of Calgary. I'm not sure I was there. But you know what? I think the world is getting there. And I don't want to lose time on the Calgary Police Service. Look, the women and men of the Calgary Police Service fully understand that they are on a journey. They're not there yet, and they've said as much this week. They're not perfect, but they're on a journey to figure out what safety means in a diverse context, what policing means in a diverse context, and how they can be allies to help marginalized people who are often people in our community be more safe.
And I don't want to take time away from that subject either, so I will allot extra time. But just before we get to that, I do want to ask you my basic question around the comments from the Premier, because others have made the question too, or the statement too, is can you actually, as many are pledging to do, fight racism without acknowledging that it's systemic?
I don't think so, because I think the real shift here is, as I say, going to that place of anti-racism. You know, I've been the mayor here for 10 years, and certainly at the City of Calgary, we talk about inclusion, we talk about diversity a lot. But have we committed to being anti-racist? Have we committed to actually fighting that racism harder where we find it? And ultimately, I think we've got to acknowledge that, yes, there's historical stuff. Yes, there's Komagatsu Maru. Yes, there is the Chinese head tax. Yes, there is Canadians from the country. And yes, there are an enormous amount of sins against Indigenous people in this country, including residential schools and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But that's not all historic. You know, I had the chance last week on Friday to spend a few hours with different social studies grade 12 classes at Western Canada High School, a school in downtown Calgary. So here are kids who go to school in the heart of downtown in one of the most diverse cities in the world. And they had all their social studies questions. You know, what do you think of Alberta's Bill 1? Talk about the division of powers. They didn't want to talk about any of that. What they wanted to talk about was racism, what it meant for them personally, and how they felt it individually as kids at one of the best public schools in the country, where they're going to have huge, bright futures. We talked about the lecture you get when you get your driver's license, which everybody gets the lecture that says, don't speed, don't text and drive, don't drink and drive. But of course, people of color get the other lecture. Don't resist. Keep your hands where they can see them. Get out of the car if they ask. Get on the ground if they ask. Don't resist. It's not worth it. This stuff still goes on. And ultimately, even in a place like Calgary, where we are proud of what we've accomplished to get out of our police service, the first step in all of this is listening and learning. Listening and learning is that it is a prerequisite to the work. And the first step in listening and learning is acknowledging there's a problem, even if it's one that we don't see every day.
So on the subject of body cameras, Mayor Nenshi, police frontline officers in Calgary have worn them since the summer. What is your assessment of how that has been going so far? And I know it's early, but has it made a difference from your perspective?
I can't say if it's made a difference. It's a little bit early to say that. I can say that it is an important tool towards transparency and accountability, and it is not a tool that the police fought in any way. The only challenges we had with it were the technical aspects of how it works for it. But ultimately, you know, you probably can see behind me my very cluttered desk. I'm back in City Hall for a day after working from home a lot. But on that desk, there is a photo of a kid named Anthony Heffernan. And Anthony lost his life in a hotel room in Calgary 5 years ago in an encounter with the police. And it just reminds me that of all the great work we do, we still have more work to do to ensure our job is making sure everyone's safe. And the body
Sorry, Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we lost your connection there. We missed the last sentence. I apologize.
I was just saying that body cameras are a great tool. They're an essential tool, but they are not at all sufficient. More conversation, more cultural shifts need to happen.
Can I ask you a question on the cost of those body cameras? Because in reading today about why other police forces decided against pursuing them after, for example, conducting pilots or studies on their use, cost was often cited, and even with the RCMP, as a prohibitive factor. Can you address that?
We had to be very creative in thinking about the cost. We had initially thought of them as a capital cost, like buying a police car or building a new police district office. And then we saw that many folks were offering these on more of a subscription model, like a Netflix thing, where the upfront cost is low, that you pay every month. And so ultimately, police agencies need to determine, would you rather pay up front, or would you rather take money out of your police budget, as you do for gas for your vehicles, to continue paying it month to month? But ultimately, police budgets are huge. In every city, it is the largest single line item. And so you have to ask yourself, should a portion of that budget go towards helping people feel more safe? And to me, that's an easy answer.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mayor Nenshi. Pleasure to have you back on the program.
Thank you so much. We got a lot of conversations to have, but as I've always said, there's nowhere in the world I'd rather be having those conversations than right here in this country and in this city. So good luck to all of us as we move to a new reality.
Thanks, Mayor. Appreciate your time. That's Calgary's Mayor Naheed Nenshi. In other news in the province, Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders abruptly announced today that he is stepping down. Saunders is the city's first Black police chief, appointed back in 2015. He's leaving that post 8 months before his contract was set to expire. When asked why, Chief Saunders did not give a specific reason, but says he's looking forward to being a full-time dad and husband.
There is no way that I was going to leave this organization unless I knew that I was satisfied that the men and women of this organization were in a safe spot, and we're there now for that. As a dad, as Mark Saunders, I can pick any time. But in my 37 plus years, I've never had an August off. And this is going to be the first time that I will have an August off with my family.
Right across the country, the conversation over police body cameras has resurfaced in the wake of George Floyd's death. Equipping police with them is one of the proposed solutions to address allegations of racism and police violence. The Prime Minister is now backing the idea and plans to discuss it, he says, with premiers this week.
In regards to body cameras, it didn't come up in our conversation last Thursday, but certainly moving forward this week, it will come up. As you know, the federal government has jurisdiction over the RCMP, but there are many other provincial and municipal police forces that should be looking at greater transparency measures as well. And I will certainly be talking about with the provinces and premiers about the need to move forward on measures like body cameras.
So are body cameras part of the answer to solving systemic racism in the police force? We have a couple of guests joining us to discuss that very subject. Alain Babineau is a former RCMP officer. He's now an advisor at the Centre for Research Action on Race Relations. And we're having a bit of, Mr. Babineau, connectivity issues with our other guest, Devon Clunas, who, of course, was the chief of the Winnipeg Police Service from 2012 to 2016. As soon as we get him hooked up properly via Skype or FaceTime, whichever it is, we'll bring him into the conversation. But Mr. Babineau, why don't I start with you? How significant do you think it was today that the Prime Minister essentially put his own backing behind equipping the RCMP with these body cameras?
Well, thanks for having me, Betsy. We appreciate it. Well, I think it's great news. I think body cameras are, an essential piece of police equipment nowadays. And as it's been mentioned before, but I think it's good for both the police and the trust in the public trust, rather. So I think it's a really good announcement. I think it's good for the RCMP to actually take the lead on this issue as a national police force. But of course, my concern will be regarding the funding of this piece of equipment, and just to make sure that it doesn't come at the detriment of other equipment or salaries or anything else on the backs of the membership of the RCMP. But I suspect that it'll come with suitable funding.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think it has to, just because now the federal government has said we want this to happen. But you raise a good point, because everything I've read, for example, there were 2 studies done at the federal level at the RCMP, but there have also been other pilot projects throughout various police forces in the country. Right. And so far, none have moved forward with it. And many times they cite cost as a reason for that.
Exactly. And so it's always the issue. I mean, cost is always an issue, right? Police budgets are limited. They're not endless funding for the police, contrary to common, some belief. Any police agency has to be, number one, properly funded. It has to be properly managed. The budget has to be properly managed. And finally, administrators have to be held to account in terms of how those monies are being spent. So I'm applauding the leadership of Mr. Trudeau, and I think it'll bode well for the RCMP. But again, it has to be suitably funded. We've had all kinds of other initiatives in the RCMP, anything from the carbines to all kinds of other things. And sometimes the funding that came along with those initiatives, had to, other priorities or other things in the RCMP had to be cut, and sometimes it's not good for the members on the frontline members.
I think we have reached Mr. Clunas now. The connectivity issue has been solved. Mr. Clunas, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent. Great to have you with us. I'll bring you right in on the same question. Mr. Babineau and I were just discussing the Prime Minister putting his backing behind body cameras for the RCMP. What do you think of that? And as far as body cameras go, what is your general assessment of their effectiveness in addressing, much of the conversation, the issues that we've been discussing over the past few weeks?
I believe they're a good tool. They won't be the panacea that's going to cure everything. I often talk about the fact that we need to get in and deal with the culture, the understanding of officers in terms of the relationship that they need to have with community. But yes, it can be part of the accountability measures. But I wonder if, cameras can actually be used more as a productivity tool as well, to ensure that maybe some of these good interactions that we're having, we're sharing those with communities. So again, rather than it simply being an accountability tool, that it can be something more than that in policing.
And let me just follow up with you, Mr. Clunas, on that, because this is the RCMP that the Prime Minister was addressing. Obviously, he doesn't have jurisdiction over, for example, municipal police forces. So far, based on what I've read, there has been some resistance, other than in Calgary, with proceeding with this due to a variety of factors. Sometimes they say technical reasons, sometimes they say the cost. Based on your experience, what will be the key to implementing body cameras at the municipal level?
I really believe the key is having officers realize that this is actually a tool that would help them. When you're involved in a fairly difficult situation and sometimes maybe allegations are made against officers, the video will actually exonerate you. So for me, this is a tool that can be used by the police to actually help not only in interactions with the community, but if an allegation is brought against you, this can actually help to protect you. So the same way we look at all the other equipment that we have that say it's here to use to protect ourselves, let's see the camera as also being part of that protective equipment that we have.
Mr. Babineau, we were discussing the issue of cost and whether, they'll be taking part of the budget to pay for this, or whether the federal government will supply new money. It highlights for me a broader conversation that has been happening, especially south of the border, but definitely studied extensively on this side of the border too, and that is the idea of defunding the police. And I want to be clear for our viewers, that doesn't mean take away all the money from police forces, but it does mean shift resources to address issues like housing and social work and mental health versus just funding the police. Where do you sit in that conversation, Mr. Babineau?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, right, a police service has to be suitably funded. It has to be properly managed. The budget has to be properly managed. And lastly, managers and administrators have to be held to account as to how the money is spent. Now, if that means reallocating funds from one set of priorities towards something else, or simply reallocated or refunding or sharing those funds with some other agencies or social services, or whatever the case is, as had been alluded to in some of the debates around defunding, well, that's fine. But again, that refunding or reallocating of money also means reallocating of resources elsewhere. But policing is not cheap. And believe it or not, members are often, and I speak for the RCMP, members are often asked to do more with less. And when members hear this idea of defunding what they already believe or perceive as being a problem in terms of funding, properly funded policing, that's not a very pleasant term for officers on the ground to hear.
I guess it becomes incumbent to make sure, Mr. Clunas, that political leaders as well as the media are sort of discussing it in context then, and making sure that it's I mean, a lot of city councillors, for example, a few in Ottawa, a few in Toronto, are putting the idea forward to city council. I guess we have to be pretty specific about what this means for various police forces. Does it mean a shifting of resources? Does it mean doing more with less? Like, I think the movement itself is more about not using police to address every issue, right? And trying to avoid some of the situations that we've seen. What do you think, Mr. Clunas, about that conversation?
No, I would agree. I've had several conversations here with media in our city just to try to bring some sensibility around the terminology. And right now, it's a very highly charged emotional environment in which we're dealing. And I think this is the wrong environment in which to make a significant policy decision. But I would agree with Elaine that what we're talking about here is a reallocation, because some of the things that police now do on a regular basis, really, we're not the best to be doing that. Mental health calls, missing persons reports, many other events in society that have fallen on the shoulders of police. We're not the best equipped to do that. And so what we're talking about is a reallocation, but you can't simply cut the police's budget right now, because until you've created the capacity within the community to address these significant issues, you'll be creating a significant void, and a lot of people will be falling through that void. So we have to be very intelligent about how we go about this. So I don't think this is the right time, because like I said, it's so emotionally charged. We're going to get some very erroneous decisions coming.
Let me ask you,
if we make the decisions right now.
Let me ask you, Mr. Babineau, from an opposite perspective, and one that's been advocated by some people who've been on the show. That, and I take your point, Mr. Clunas, that you don't want to make a huge decision that massively overhauls policy in this moment. But they put the point to me: if not now to have this discussion, if not now to push forward on changes, then when? Mr. Babineau?
Well, I think the conversation has to be had. I mean, and I don't think Mr. Clunas was suggesting that we should put everything in abeyance, but I think the conversation has to be had progressively, and it has to include the community and to look at, suitable ways of altering policing. There was an idea floating out there that I read in terms of, replacing vast areas of policing with some newly founded unit or something brand new. Now, because allegedly our police officers are racist, or there's racism, there's biases, and so on and so forth. The question that I have is that if you form this new funded and created unit, where are the people going to be coming from? Because racism and bias and discrimination is in this society, no matter where you look, whether it be social services, the education system, the health system, and so on and so forth. So those people coming into this new unit are going to be coming in with their biases and so on and so forth. So I think the idea is more to make sure that we screen people properly coming in, we monitor them through the process, we identify their racist tendency, if there are any, or biases and whatnot, and we deal with them appropriately. So, but this notion of looking for people that are going to be coming into this new unit completely bias-free, and I don't know where they're going to be coming from.
Okay, a lot of food for thought, but unfortunately I'm out of time, so I have to leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you for your time this evening. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Devon Clunas and Alain Babineau. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.